Talk about HDR, which in many ways is the future of all delivery and colouring and shooting for film content and video content and TV content. Is the way that everything is heading at the moment, and we need to be kind of prepared, even though you might say we're a little early on for that. Possibly it's a bit cutting edge, but I think there's enough out there, there's enough devices out there, there's support from Sony, Apple, obviously Netflix are doing a huge amount with HDR. We've got the World Cup being shown in HDR by people like BBC. Everything's moving in that direction. And so if we can sort things out now, kind of get our heads around what we need to think about when we're shooting it, and of course what we need to do when we're color grading it, then we can kind of get a head start on the competition, and we can start to take advantage of everything that HDR offers. So why is HDR going to be so big? What does it have to offer us? Well, it's a much more realistic representation of the world around us. There are huge discrepancies in the darkest things that we can see and the brightest things that we can see. But up until now, televisions and computer screens, they've only been able to show us a tiny amount of the brightness that exists in the world around us. Our eyes are fantastic at managing this. We can, at any one time, see a contrast ratio of 10,000 to 1, but our televisions have never been able to do that very well. Funnily enough, our cameras have been able to capture a large dynamic range for a little while now through the use of things like log curves, which are even in things like drones these days and smartphones. They are a means of compressing dynamic range and being able to fit it into a smaller container. So if you can record with a log curve and capture more dynamic range, and now we're starting to find computer screens and televisions and mobile devices that are allowing us to see that stretched additional brightness, then you're getting into a place where the stuff that you're looking at is a far more realistic representation of the whole world around us and the way that our eye sees these highlight details. You do need a lot of data to then stretch this HDR and pin it where all these highlights now live that are sort of 10 times brighter than where they lived with SDR. So I guess that might be a penalty. That might be something that prevents you from stepping into HDR if you're only shooting with an 8-bit camera at the moment. But just like HDR, there's a huge amount of momentum in the industry moving us towards minimum of 10-bit for our cameras. There are even mobile phones out there now that can shoot 10-bit. And so I think, again, it's all part of being ready for when it comes about. And there are cameras out there that have, you can shoot internal RAW with a Canon C200. That's a price point that only a year or so ago, no one would have even dreamed that you could have 10 and in fact 12-bit recording with a camera like that at that price point. So it's about getting ready for it. So that I could get ready to show you what you can do with HDR, I took a little trip to Richmond in London to meet up with Philip Bloom, and we took a walk down the Thames, him with his camera, me with mine, shooting some content with the idea of bringing it back to the color grading suite and having a look at this HDR material and just seeing what we could do and what possibilities it opens up. Hello.
Ollie.
Fancy seeing you here.
Fancy seeing you here.
What are you doing? Filming in Richmond?
I live here, and I film
crazy.
here every single day of the year because every day is different. The sun is different, the skies are different, the people are the same, but it's the best part of London, really.
I think if I lived here, I'd probably do exactly the same. It's an incredibly beautiful spot. I am here with you in your beautiful hometown to capture shiny things, essentially, because with HDR, we're opening up a huge new world of highlights.
Yep.
And so thankfully the weather has been kind to us and given us a nice little break in the cloud.
Yeah, no, we've got a lot of sparkly reflections going on in the Thames right now, but I think it's looking nice.
The sun is in and out, but it's kind of giving us what we want because we're talking about HDR.
Yeah.
And HDR is all about these bright specular highlights, things that normally we can't squeeze into our standard dynamic range that suddenly HDR opens up to us.
Yeah, I mean, look, these conditions are fine shooting B-roll. You can stop and start. If you're actually filming us, then that's
Who
where
would try and shoot an interview in these situations?
that's where it becomes really hard, and you have to try and squeeze it into the moments between the planes, the trains, the boats, and the sun.
Yeah.
But the dynamic range is challenging. It's as challenging as you're going to get when you get reflections off of the Thames. And but it looks great though. It looks
does.
Even if you clip it, it doesn't matter. It still looks great. You don't want to hold those highlights because then you'll have darkness all around you. It's so dazzlingly bright.
Yeah, I think people do often stress out about clipped highlights, and HDR doesn't mean a future with no clipped highlights, because the sun is incredibly bright, brighter than HDR is going to allow us to contain, and we don't necessarily need to. It's absolutely fine.
You don't want everything to look like those over-processed
Yeah.
HDR photos. You want things to look natural. Yeah, we have the ability to, our auto exposure with our eyes is amazing. And we have to do our best with the camera. But we know what to see, and what we can see an incredible amount of detail. But even right now, my eyes are clipping on that.
Well, this is
water,
exactly the point. There's no way that you can't look at the sun, you can't look at bright reflections. If you look at the maximum we can see and the lowest we can see when you've got your night vision, yes, that's huge, but we don't see all of that at one time. We only see about 10,000 to 1 at one point. This FS5 has got the firmware upgrade to chuck out 12-bit RAW, which is then being captured by what you've got on top there. So talk me through that.
I mean, this is a nice camera, but internally shooting 4K, it's 8-bit only, 408-bit. And you can get away with log to a point, S-Log2, if you expose perfectly. It's very unforgiving. This raw output that you get with the firmware into this recorder, the Inferno, turns this camera into a beast. I mean, I don't like having to use external recorders because it adds cumbersome things. It's fun on a tripod, but on handheld it's awkward. But to take this 12-bit RAW, and prior to using ProRes RAW, which I'm using right now, I just turned the 12-bit RAW into a ProRes 10-bit signal, and it looked amazing. Lovely to shoot full RAW, but the amount of data that it uses and the computing power is just, especially on a Cinema DNG like recorder like this, it's fine if you have more of a compressed RAW. The compressed RAW in here works pretty well. And Red has incredibly good RAW because it has this compression ratio, but for the rest of things, it is difficult. RAW photos are amazing. I only ever shoot RAW photos, but video, I've had RAW cameras since 2010, 2011, I think it is. And I probably shot maybe 3 or 4 hours in all those years. That's about it.
And I think, well, this is why Apple have brought out ProRes RAW. I think it is the solution to that. In a world where we're moving towards cheaper and bigger capacities and cheaper storage, it makes sense to shoot RAW as often as you can. But with that has come a penalty, as you say, in terms of computational power. And that's where a compressed RAW like ProRes RAW allows you to essentially have your cake and eat it, because you can cut, in real time. You can scrub through, skim through. You've got kind of almost no penalty in terms of overhead, but you've got all that raw data in there as well, which is incredibly important when it comes to HDR, because we need as much data as we can possibly get, because we're spreading it thinner.
Yeah, I mean, it does spoil you though, shooting like this. I mean, I shoot a lot of stuff on smaller cameras, like this, 8-bit, 4K. I've been shooting 8-bit for many, many years, and I know its limitations. I know what I can get out of it, and I don't push it. I know this is too much of a challenge. I won't shoot S-Log3 in it, for example. Having something like this is, if you've never shot anything over 8-bit, you're in for a huge surprise of what you can actually hold in your exposures.
Yeah, I mean, so for the C200, this is my camera, I brought along just to play catch up.
I have one too, it's lovely.
So the C200 is particularly interesting for me because you've got two choices. You've got 50p 10-bit in there, compressed RAW, their Canon RAW Lite, but you've also got 25p 12-bit. So 10-bit really is your bare minimum for HDR. You need to have enough information in each of those color channels to push them. They're going to be going to heights they've never been to before, so you need to have that information there. 8-bit's just not enough. I kind of liken it to like a pizza. You want a big pizza, but you have a small lump of dough, which is your 8-bit. It's just going to start to get thin, and it's going to start to fall apart. You need a big lump of dough, and that's what these cameras with ProRes RAW, with Canon RAW Lite, so with R3D, with Arri RAW, with any large 10-bit or over codec, you're going to have what you need, basically. The whole industry is moving incredibly quickly, as we know, but HDR has kind of exploded onto the scene. It's being pushed really heavily by major industry players.
Yeah.
You've got things like ProRes RAW literally only coming out weeks ago and changing the game again. And I think, although you might be thinking, I'm never going to be able to afford a camera with 10-bit or let alone 12-bit or any of those things, you probably will in a year's time or 2 years' time. It's just moving inexorably in that direction.
There's already mirrorless cameras that shoot 10-bit. You can even buy a mobile phone now that shoots 10-bit HDR, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So you got it out there.
And in fact, the mobile HDR thing is a really important point, because not only is the capability of capturing 10-bit and above and RAW becoming more and more possible, watching HDR back, this is the other part of this is the lock to the key. So if you can watch HDR, people want it. As soon as you see HDR in the flesh, you you kind of get it straight away. It's not
Yeah.
like 3D where it was awkward and I had to put glasses on. HDR is incredible once you see it.
You know, people, you know, I love resolution. I need to shoot in the high resolution. But when you're looking at TV that has 4K and has HDR, it's the HDR part that you're really going to see the difference.
Yeah,
Hugely.
no, you're absolutely right. I think now's the time. I think people need to get on board now and be ready for it because it's where everything's going, basically.
Well, I hope so, because otherwise, what's the point of this episode?
And on that bombshell, let's go and shoot some stuff. Look, there's a duck. Let's go and film him.
That way.
Okay.
That's actually a nice shot there. I got some nice bright bits there.
You know what?
I've stolen. I'll give you that lens back in a sec. Hang on.
Now, what have I got here? 50 mil?
Yeah, sorry, mate.
Nothing
You were
like 50
tapping
mil.
and I wanted to shoot. I mean, I've had very little experience with HDR. I don't have HDR monitors in my edit suite. The only HDR proper screen I have is my TV, and I have my films on Apple TV, which are in HDR. I have some Netflix stuff, which is in HDR, and it looks cool. It's great, and you know, it'd be nice. You know, I do need to upgrade my edit suite, but the cost of the HDR stuff is still very expensive. But the concept of actually being able to hold so much of your highlights in your image is wonderful. It really is, and it's watching live broadcasts in 4K, which I've been watching a lot of recently, which aren't HDR, and it's like, oh, it's a shame they can't do that because it would look so much better, especially when you're looking at things like the football during the daytime and you have these really bright areas on the stadium and stuff on the pitch, and it's so drastically different. You go, God, I hope HDR comes to the consumer, everything, really soon.
So is there anything that I need to do when I'm shooting for HDR? Well, really the advice is the same as ever. It is to prioritize highlights and to ride them as high as you dare go with the brightest thing in your scene whilst still keeping them in. You're still recording into a container. So if you clip in camera, it's still going to be gone. You can't recover that just because you're going to be delivering in HDR. So as ever, you want to make sure that you ride the brightest thing in your scene up high, keep it right at the top so that the brightest things are just before they clip. And it doesn't matter if you bring this stuff back down, that's fine, that's not going to destroy anything. The problems are when you've clipped or if you've underexposed and you're trying to pull that out. So really the advice is the same advice that I would give you if you were shooting SDR. Oh, now we lose the sun.
I got a long bit of it.
Yeah, no, there's still loads of specular highlights off that. In fact, it's better because those other highlights with the sun out would probably be like 10,000 nits.
I have no idea if this is in focus. Yeah, it is.
Lovely. That'll look great. You can see now, see his shirt's probably hitting like 100 nits. So now we're just down to... It's great. That'll look really nice. So what is a nit? It seems like a very strange term, doesn't it? A nit is a bit of a colloquialism, to be honest. It's not actually a scientific term. It's a unit of measurement, I suppose, that's a simpler way of saying candelas per square meter. So CDM squared is the measured amount of light from one candle in a square meter. And so 1 nit is 1 CDM squared. Traditionally, with broadcast color grading, your monitor would be set to 100 nits. With HDR, what we're talking about are screens that can go so bright that they go up to 1,000 nits. There are even 4,000 nit displays in existence, and probably in future they'll be much, much higher. The point is about all this extra brightness is that it unlocks the additional range of highlights. So for example, we've had to frame out the roof of the building behind me because it's bright white and the sun is reflecting off of it so that it's exceeding the range that we can deliver to you with standard dynamic range 4K. Hopefully in future, everyone will have HDR displays and we wouldn't have had to frame out the roof of this building, and you'll be able to capture it and place it accurately at 1,000 nits or 2,000 nits or wherever it actually falls, and thereby give the viewer a far more realistic interpretation of the environment around me. But we're not there yet, and that's why we've had to frame it out of the shot.
This is so nice. I should film it more often. Oh, I do.
Yeah, why do you never take advantage of what's on your doorstep, Phil?
No, I need to go somewhere further afield.
So where to next?
A bit closer down, we've got the boat slipways, the pubs where people hang out on the water.
I'll tell you what,
Oh, the ducks.
I was going to say, but do we get any swans around here?
We sometimes get swans. They tend to be a bit further down in Twickenham, but we might have some. And you can also get a seal here. 10 seals, they come down.
A white seal?
It's in the water, I can't tell. All right, so basically need to wait for that sun to come in and out, but what should we get?
Anything highly reflective. So a white shirt as a minimum.
Yeah.
But like glass, metal.
If the sun comes out, we're going to have the people sat on the green, but we're still going to be better off with the Thames, to be honest with you. But
Yeah.
still want to be too repetitive in our shots.
No.
We do have a fair bit of people with white.
Well,
We have the white building here as well.
Something like reflections in people's sunglasses and glasses
Yeah.
and stuff. I think that would work well. All those kind of objects that are giving us reflections that normally we would have to compromise with, that's going to be gold.
All right, let's head down to that middle spot over there
Okay.
between the two. Yeah, that's going to be a good spot to shoot.
Actually, with this lens, I might pick up some of those planes.
Yeah, got the planes, got some lovely God rays. You wanted bright reflections? You've got them. I think my retina's burnt out.
Do your worst. So what are the choices with HDR? Well, there are really two main choices with HDR at the moment. There is PQ and there is HLG. HLG, or hybrid log gamma, is a curve that was developed specifically for backward compatibility with older TVs and older technology, because it's a form of HDR that allows it to scale up or down from SDR to HDR and even brighter HDR that may come in future. So I think if you're recording content now that's for broadcast delivery and you want to kind of give yourself an insurance policy against HDR, record it 10-bit, record it with HLG, and you will find that that's scalable depending on what kind of outcome you want from it. The other main way of capturing HDR is with a curve called PQ, Perceptual Quantizer. It was developed by Dolby and is now been used as the foundation for HDR with HDR10, HDR10 Plus, and Dolby Vision, which Dolby developed out of their research into PQ. And this is a curve that it's not backwards compatible, but it does allow you, if you know the brightness of the display you're delivering to give a much more vivid representation of HDR, and also something that's got far more control about it because you know what you're delivering to and you can master to a set level with that. Because of that, it's not backwards compatible, and it's probably something that I see finding more of a home in online delivery, in Ultra HD Blu-ray discs and cinema delivery, where there's a bit more control over how you think your viewer's going to be seeing it. It's not like these two are competing. It's not HLG versus PQ who will win, like it was with VHS and Beta. This is more about different ways of delivering HDR content for different technologies and different people with different abilities to view that content.
When you are shooting, knowing that you're going to be HDR, it's really nice because you know that you have that more latitude. You are able. You see a really fantastic shot, and it's incredibly challenging. And normally you'd struggle enormously to hold that, to have that. And we were looking for shots specifically to challenge that. Normally shots that I would kind of like, nice, but a bit too much, came out really well.
You see the seagull
Yeah.
on top of the, because he's white and he's got the sun hitting him. See if we can ride him quite high, and that's great because we've got these deep blacks. See, he can sit like when I'm grading him, that highlight on the back of his neck, I can hit that at 500 nits, 600 nits, somewhere around that level. That's the kind of thing that just HDR's made for.
Perfect. Well positioned then, Seagull.
Well done, seagull. I tell you what, you're also getting is those little highlights off the cars as they pass
Yeah.
through the balustrades as well. It's great. So that's ideal. Ready?
Yep.
Didn't work.
Very good. We have a winner. Nice and bright. Lots of reflections. It's your money shot.
Let's have a look.
It was when they were going along.
Looks great.
Oh, there comes the plane. Hopefully I'm framed up right.
So one of the big things with HDR is it unlocks all these kind of specular highlights, everything that kind of builds on top of 100 nits, basically. So anything that's highly reflective and gives you those kind of bright specular highlights just absolutely comes off the screen in HDR. So we've got our good friend Guy here. Come and show yourself, Guy. Don't be shy, Guy. I've asked Guy to come down with his Triumph. We're just starting golden hour now, so we're going to take the bike around the corner. We've got loads of highly reflected surfaces on the bike. We've got chrome, we've got reflective, shiny paint and mirrors and all kinds of good specular highlights, hopefully. So we're going to take it around the corner now and we're going to grab some content, and it's hopefully going to play really nicely into the hands of our HDR deliverable. Let's go, Guy. See, that's perfect. Let's just look at the waveform. So you've got all the detail in the bottle. It's clipping a bit here in the bokeh, but you know,
Not much I can do, yeah.
Well,
But it looks good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not a panic because this is our subject.
We don't want everything to be flat, and we want
No,
dark and we want bright.
it looks great. It looks really good. And see that point where she brings out the bottle and the sun catches in the bottle? That's what HDR's for.
Yeah.
It's perfect because in the past we would have to clamp that down. We would, that's naturally falling at thousands of nits, you know. And it's going to, even with HDR, we're going to probably have to bring that down to 1,000, which is probably less than it actually is. But with SDR, that's coming all the way down to 100.
We've got the whole range. We've got some dark areas there. This is really bright. This is a perfect HDR
wow,
shot.
that's really cool when those girls jump behind her as
I
well.
know, yeah. I was all directed.
Do you know what? I'm pleased I booked you now. I was worried for a moment, but
It's luck. Shooting this sort of stuff is luck. And also patience. You've got to take your time. You've got to be here for a while, and you've got to not just get the first shot. Just use your eyes and see what's going on and see what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Get in a position for it and wait. And that's what I saw with these girls. I thought they wanted to get a jumping selfie. I positioned myself to where they were. I waited, got the shot. Sun's gone.
yeah, I knew you were going to say that. Yes, I know.
Should we-
The sun has gone.
Can we stop now?
Yeah. Should we
Cool.
drink?
Go to the
Yeah,
pub?
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
What about the bike? Leave it.
Yeah, let Guy sort that out.
Yeah.
As a colorist, it's always great news when you get told that something you're about to work on was shot raw. There are varying different flavors of RAW codec out there, and there's actually becoming more and more of them. Apple recently introduced their ProRes RAW, for example, which is joining now things like Canon C200's RAW Lite. Of course, there's Red R3D, you have ARRI RAW. There are quite a few different RAW formats out there now. Cinema DNG is another popular one. The thing about RAW is it really gives you a lot of latitude to push your image around, and not because images need to be manipulated. You know, if you're working with a great DP, you shouldn't need to have to correct much at all. It's more to do with the latitude you've got to experiment, and that obviously plays well into the hands of creative grading and trying out looks that maybe push your image quite far. It's always quite fun to kind of push your clips to the point of breaking and then to see where you can kind of pull them back in and just what happens. You know, there's some really interesting things that might come out of that. And RAW allows you to go to those edges, and those edges are far out. You've got kind of more of a playground to play in, which is really exciting from a colorist point of view. I'd far rather hear that and think of the kind of overheads in terms of storage and speed of my RAID than be told that you've got these tiny little files that are 420, 8-bit, heavily compressed and underexposed, because yeah, that's not going to take up much space on my RAID system, and it's not going to be hard to kind of work with that stuff in terms of CPU and GPU load. But I'm going to spend probably hours and hours trying to clean up noise and recover information that might not even be there. So RAW is a real blessing when it comes to color grading. So what is RAW? What actually is a RAW file? Well, all cameras work by photons of light hitting a silicon layer, these sensors, and they're kind of like photovoltaic cells, like the solar panels you might have on your roof. They're essentially turning light into electricity. But at that scale, what's happening is this sensor is split up into lots and lots of little photosites. And each one of those photosites is converting light energy into an electrical charge. And the higher that electrical charge, the more light energy was converted, and so the brighter that part of your scene was. So it can actually infer from that how bright different parts of your image were, and therefore create actually a black and white image. So it's creating a monochromatic representation of whatever you're pointing your camera at. So how do we get color from that? Well, a guy called Bryce Bayer back in the 70s invented what's known as a color filter array. And the color filter array sits on top of the sensor wafer, and it basically means that each photosite is having the light that enters it filtered, and it's either green, red, or blue. So it's filtering out everything else, so that you can now say, well, it's not just this intensity of light generally, but this intensity of green or red or blue at that photosite's location. Now again, does that help us? Is the world around us either red, green, or blue? No, but the human visual system works in exactly that way. We have short, medium, and long wavelength photoreceptors called cones in our eyes, and they're doing the same thing. They're sampling the light around us in those areas, those blues and those greens and those reds, and then they're using post-processing, in our case our brains, to infer all of the other colors from that and plot where things are, and it's using a kind of a white balance system as well. They're actually very similar, and there's a good reason for that. It's because we've built our cameras to mimic as best we can the way our eyes work. And that refinement process, that kind of goal of matching what our eyes can do, is a constant process. In some ways we may have kind of surpassed what our eyes can do. In many ways our cameras can see an awful lot more colors if they wanted to than our eyes could see. Actually our displays can't, and that's why we're kind of limited to what we deliver. But in terms of capture and acquisition, cameras have been able to capture more colors than our eyes can see for a long time. Dynamic range is basically caught up now, and in some cases superseded. So there's a constant refinement and moving in that direction, and RAW is kind of part and parcel of that. So the color filter array that sits on top of the sensor allows the sensor to actually infer and use algorithms to decide what the colors were in our scene and give us a color image, which is great. The cool thing about being able to capture that raw data and store it and bring it into your color grading package, or your editing package, is that with those raw data values, you can manipulate them and then see the results instantly. So rather than a compressed format where the camera captures raw, immediately encodes that into a compressed format and then hands you that file, with RAW you're being handed the original raw information off the sensor, and you can actually change it before you deliver essentially your own encoded file. So at the point where you want to actually deliver it and encode it, at the end, you've baked in the look that you've created already. So it's actually pushing all of that further down the line, giving you a much higher quality digital negative to work with and to color grade, which is fantastic. The process of using these algorithms to essentially undo the color filter array and give a realistic interpretation of your image is known as debayering. So you're literally undoing Bryce Bayer's color filter array. So you're debayering. It's also known as demosaicing. Those algorithms are of varying complexities, and if I go into this red clip here, for example, into the camera raw settings, the very first option it gives me is my decode quality, how complex the algorithm is that it's going to use to debayer and decode the image. If I want it to give me the most accurate colors and the best image to work with, I can use the full res premium, but that's going to be very complex for both the CPU and the GPU to decode on the fly, and so playback will be, well, to call it stuttering would be an understatement. So if I stick it in full res premium and hit play, we're getting, oh, it's actually not too bad. Well, I'm using an iMac Pro. It's actually managed to get 21 frames per second out of that, so pretty good. Surprisingly good. Never done that before. It kind of ramps up a bit, and it kind of seems to settle around the 21 frames per second kind of mark, but it's not playing in real time. This is a very quick system, I'd admit, but I can speed that up by, let's go half res good, for example, and we should be able to get There you go. We're at full, so we see that little green 25 frames per second. We're now playing in real time. So I've literally told it to decode and debear that raw information on the fly in a more efficient, less accurate, but more efficient way. Now, as I drill down further, I can change more about this clip because the raw file allows you to kind of tinker the DNA of the clip, if you like, and therefore have essentially, there's no negative consequence to that, or certainly nothing that would have been any more negative than if you'd done it in camera at the time. So you can see here, for example, I can change my ISO, I can change my color temperature, I can even things like denoising, which I can have an influence on, which is great. Some cameras slightly over denoise, I find. Others don't do it enough. So being able to open up these parameters is fantastic. What you see in here varies depending on the actual type of raw codec. So this is a red file and this is everything I have. If I click on this file, this is a Canon C200 RAW Lite file, and I have a different range of things. So some of them aren't available to me, some of them are. You can see that there's a difference. They're laid out differently, and it's clearly showing me what the engineers that have made Resolve have allowed me to do. In different programs, you have different options, some of them similar, some of them more limited, but essentially with the RAW, if it's supported by the software you're using, you should be able to manipulate basic things like exposure, like saturation, normally sharpness as well. And you can even see here with the C200 we have mid-tone detail available. Mid-tone detail is incredibly valuable, particularly when working with skin tones, as we've just heard. And so having that ability to change that at the raw level gives me a much more realistic and less damaging result. There's a more authentic result because of that, because we're doing it at the raw level rather than after that. So there's all kinds of possibilities that get opened up when I'm shooting RAW and using the camera RAW settings in my software to manipulate that file.
I'd like to think we only shoot RAW in the future. Hopefully we'll start to come in more and more. I'm sure, we won't always, or you might have a dual record option. I think that might come in a lot more. Coming from a stills background, I only ever shot RAW. So right all the way up to, I used to use the Cine 645 cameras. We used to shoot 192 megapixel shots. So, that they were fairly large files, and that was always in RAW. So in stills world, I couldn't ever see myself shooting a compressed file, and I'd like to see the same in motion. I don't see the point in shooting it, especially now we've got the ProRes RAW and the Cinema RAW Lite from Canon. 128 gigs, 16 minutes. It's really not that much. Not with the way data is coming down in price. I mean, storage now is so much cheaper. You should be able to shoot, and if you shoot in RAW, you'll always be able to almost pull that image that you need. Shooting a compressed file or an MP4 or anything else, you're always going to have a problem. You're never going to be able to pull that image you want to get out of it.
Because this is a much larger file, it's containing a lot more information in it. There is a kind of a desire to want to move towards RAW files that give you all of these benefits but are still small-ish, and that's where compressed RAW comes in. Red were one of the first, if not the first, people to really bring to mass market a compressed RAW, a usable RAW. But Canon are now on board with a Canon RAW Lite, which is great. I love the use of that in my C200. You've got Apple, who've just introduced ProRes RAW. I think what you'll find in future is that RAW becomes just the norm as capacity goes up and costs of per gigabyte goes down and read-write speeds increase. I think, in maybe 5 years, 10 years, who knows, we will just all be shooting RAW, not even thinking about it.
If we say shooting on the C200, I don't find the files too big at all. So, I keep it as a very simple workflow. We shoot RAW on the camera, we expose correctly. We expose off the waveform on the camera. And then what I do is I either have enough cards that we know we're covered, or I'm quite lucky that we have a RAID that we take on set and it pulls off those cards very quickly. And then in terms of RAW, shooting RAW and getting to post, then it opens up everything, because the C200 you can pull out more out of a RAW file than you can out of anything that's got a compression on it, because the RAW just opens you up everything on that image. If you've got a highlight that looks blown out, you can almost guarantee you'll be able to pull it back. If you've got a shadow, you can lift it. So yes, you have a few more decisions to make along the way, I think. But once you're there, in terms of color grading, it's a really nice workflow.
So another thing that you can do when you're working with RAW is you can actually make changes to the fundamental color space and gamma that you're working with. Your color space is literally the amount of colors that your file contains, your media contains. And as I said, the cameras these days can actually record an awful lot more colors than our eyes can see. The colors that our eyes can see is plotted on a very well-known graph from 1931, which has the snappy title CIE 1931 XYZ. And that graph shows you all the colors that our eyes can see. That's known as a gamut. Okay, so if you ever hear that term gamut, what it means is, well, the common analogy is it's a bucket. The bigger the gamut, the bigger the bucket, the more things you can fit in it. I also like to liken it to like a pack of crayons. You know, if you have a limited gamut, you have only a small pack of crayons with only a limited number of possibilities in there. If you have a large gamut, you have a big chunky pack of 200 colors of crayons or whatever. You have one of those big jumbo packs. So the bigger the gamut, the more kind of flexibility in color choice and accuracy potentially in color choice you have. So you can change to different color spaces, because if you've captured, in this case it's set to Dragon Color 2. If I come in here and say, well, actually I want to work just in a standard dynamic range broadcast deliverable gamut, I can set it to Rec 709, and the colors change considerably, and they don't necessarily look very good, and that's because Rec 709 has a color space, a gamut based on sRGB, which is quite an old gamut and quite a small gamut. It only covers about 30% of what our eyes can see. But it was limited by what we could achieve with our TVs and our computer screens and such like. So it was designed to be small to support a wider range of older, less technologically advanced televisions. It's now becoming a bit dated and a bit old, which is why it's being replaced with things like Rec 2020, and we have camera gamuts, which are huge now. But Rec 2020 is interesting because this is a larger color gamut that is kind of setting us up for television and delivery to devices going forwards. The color gamut of Rec 2020 supports in excess of 70% coverage of what our eye can see. So there's a huge number of more colors. I think Rec 2020 is a suite of recommendation. I think it supports up to 12-bit as well, which is like 68 billion colors, I think. Whereas Rec 709 only supported up to 16 million colors. So the future is a future with a lot more latitude and a lot more color and a lot more color volume. So that's what color space is, and that's why we might want to change it depending on where we're delivering to. Now we've also got these gamma curves, so gamut and gamma. Gamma is all about spread of tonality, so it's about contrast essentially, and how that's plotted. And you can see here, because it's RAW, I have the ability to actually change the gamma, whereas normally that would be baked in, for example. So what's cool here is I can just say, well, let's just have a standard Rec 709 gamma. And I can essentially set this up. Let's go to Rec 709 color space, Rec 709 gamma, and then I can grade based on this for straightforward, normal, standard dynamic range delivery to any current display technology that's out there right now. But what if I'm wanting to work in HDR, for example, or what if I'm wanting to deliver something that's got a more filmic kind of roll-off of highlights, for example, certainly whilst I'm grading? Well, this is why RAW is so useful, because I can actually change the gamma and the way that it has plotted the spread from black to white, and give it something that opens up more room in the shadows or gives me nicer roll-off in the highlights and gives me a flexibility that I wouldn't have without RAW. Without RAW, that would have been decided in camera and burnt in, and that's it. You can't change it. So for me, both the Storm, which Sam has given me to grade, and my own choice of camera, the C200 that this is being filmed on right now, those are cameras that are capable of RAW, and I choose to work with them if I can as often as possible, because it opens up all kinds of creative opportunities for me as a colorist and makes my life much, much easier. So once you've tried out RAW, you kind of almost don't want to go back to working with compressed formats again. If you haven't tried it out, get your hands on some. You can download demo files from Red Zone website, from Canon and Sony's website. There's places you can go, and Arri's website. There's places you can go to download source and demo files to try out for yourself, but get them into your program. They're supported in Premiere, in Final Cut and Resolve and other programs as well. And that will allow you to sort of see what you can do with it and see why potentially it's something you want to introduce on your next production, or something so that when you're quoting your next client for a color session, that you're taking into consideration how much work is there to do. I know if I hear we've shot a 30, 60-minute documentary on DSLRs, I know that I'm going to kind of have more work to do because it's a less robust codec. It's not going to give me the latitude for correction that RAW gives me. So it can actually be a very useful function for quoting for your work as well. RAW's here, it's here to stay, it's getting more and more common. Have a play with it, get prepared for working with it more in the future, and just have fun with it.
I mean, the way that I see it is that it's a bigger bucket. You can choose to do what you want with it. I don't think it needs to be, everything doesn't need to be graded in HDR, and if the world suits SDR, I'm quite excited. I'm excited about the larger colour space more than anything, because I've been doing feature film grading in P3. Once you see P3 red and then Rec 709 red, you're just like, how is Rec 709 red enough? And so the larger colour space associated with HDR, once that sort of kicks off, is quite exciting from a storytelling element, as is the increased dynamic range. So it's kind of twofold, because the colour volume is just going to be absolutely massive. I don't know in terms of volume how much larger it is than SDR, but it
goes from 35% to 77%.
Right, well there you go. So it's a pretty big jump. The End of the Fucking World Season 2 or maybe I should say the End of the Effing World Season 2 will be HDR. And yeah, I'm sort of taking inspiration at the moment from Glow, graded by Ian Vertevec. And I it's quite interesting to see that sort of film emulation, film look with the extended highlights. I'm quite enjoying that. And I'm quite excited to delve into it. I haven't really done any HDR jobs. I've played around with it. But yeah, we're kind of waiting for the monitoring to get sorted out. But all Netflix commissioned series this year have to deliver HDR. So that's going to push the industry forward a bit. And yeah, exciting times.
One word of warning when you are choosing an HDR monitor for working with HDR content is to not be misleaded by the maximum luminance output. So if a display says that it can achieve a maximum luminance output of 1000 nits, that doesn't mean it can do it across the whole panel. The ISO CG3145 that we're using at the moment can sustain 1000 nits across the entire panel, but most can't. In fact, that's one of the first HDR monitors that can do that. I have an LG 55-inch OLED HDR TV at home, and it claims 1000 nits. The reality is it's more like 700, and if I try and feed it something that's too bright, it clamps it down to protect itself. Because if you think about it, when a monitor is showing 1000 nits, it's going to have to get very hot, because it's literally, its brightness is up high, and as we know, light equals heat and energy. So we need normally something quite big and chunky with big fans to keep it cool. If you think of a thin OLED, it doesn't have that. And so most of these TVs that claim high luminance, actually, sometimes they can claim that even if only 1% of the pixels on the screen can attain that maximum level. So some might claim a high max CLL or maximum content light level. So they might say they're 1000 nits, for example, but they could have low average brightness, or MAXFUL, which stands for maximum frame average light level. That measures how much of the frame can average those high values. It could be really low, in which case you're probably better off waiting for a better quality monitor that can sustain higher levels, because otherwise you'll run into problems with, for example, if you're grading a scene with the sky in it and it occupied a large chunk of the frame, well, most of those bright highlights in the clouds would fall up in the HDR region of luminance. But if your monitor can't support sustained brightness that high across such a large part of the image, it will just clamp it down to sustain itself, to essentially protect itself from overheating. And then what was the point of doing it in HDR? So, this is all very new, and these TVs are very new, and it's kind of the cutting edge of what's happening right now. But these are things you need to be aware of when recording and delivering HDR. When it comes to color grading HDR, the most important thing by far is that you have a good quality HDR reference monitor. You physically cannot color grade HDR material without an HDR monitor. It's as simple as that. So if you don't have that, then wait until you've got one, and then you can start to work with it. The HDR monitor that we're using here today is the ISO Prominence CG3145. It's a 31-inch 1000 nit panel, so it's very bright, which is what you want for HDR. But that's not because you want all HDR to be bright. Of course, with HDR, what we're really looking to do is to keep the bulk of the image under that 100 nits for standard dynamic range, but allow us to open up the extra 900 nits above that this particular monitor is going to allow us to see. 1000 nits is probably a good kind of ballpark, because although things are changing very quickly, most TVs that people are buying and bringing into their home that are HDR are in that kind of area of brightness. So I think 1000 nits is probably is a good benchmark. If you've got a 500 nit HDR capable display, I would say that you're possibly gonna, even if you did grade stuff successfully at that level, you'd quite quickly find that it didn't look that different from SDR anyway, and that other people were grading stuff that would exceed the luminance that you're able to show with your panel anyway. So 1000 is a good point right now. I think going forwards, we're going to be moving into 2, 3, 4,000 nit kind of area, and HDR is going to really kind of come into its own. But right now, with the technology that's available to us, 1000 nits seems to be quite a healthy number for a good quality HDR reference panel. So now I've got this here, and I can actually see the actual HDR values, the values that are riding up above 100 nits. And I've got Final Cut Pro 10 open at the moment, because Final Cut Pro 10 is the only software right now that works with Apple's new ProRes RAW codec. And that's what Philip was shooting when we were down in Richmond. So if I play through this stuff here, these are various different shots that Philip was getting. ProRes RAW has all the data that we need for this, and to send that HDR out to our monitor, we can use an additional device. So the Arja IO 4K is the device at the moment that would allow that to come out. For now though, I'm going to go back into Resolve, where I've got some raw material that came from my C200, which I was shooting, doing a very poor imitation of Mr. Bloom alongside him. But there's a few shots that I got which I can show you inside Resolve. So I'm just going to jump into the color panel here. This material starts out incredibly flat, because this is the raw file, and this is just the raw gamma. I haven't even transformed it to a kind of a viewable gamma yet. And when it comes to HDR, like with any file, you can start grading it straight away, or you can apply a transform to kind of get it roughly in the right ballpark. There are a few different ways that I can transform this raw image into roughly the right gamut and gamma that I can then start working from. The first way and the easiest way is to use DaVinci Resolve's built-in color management. So if I go to the color management preferences, I can use the DaVinci YRGB color managed option, and I can tell it what this has come in as. So this has come in as Canon Cinema gamut, and I can choose Canon Log 3 or Canon Log 2. I'm going to go with Canon Log 3. Canon Log 3 as a curve is actually the same as Canon Log up to about middle grey, and then the top just brings in more highlights, so it's more compressed in the highlights and brings down more dynamic range up there. And so because this image doesn't have a huge amount of shadow detail but lots of bright highlights, Log 3 is the appropriate one to choose here. My timeline color space, this actually doesn't change the way it looks, it changes the way that the tools respond and the interface responds. So I'm going to just set that to standard Rec 2020 color space and a Rec 2100, which is a ST2084, which is SMPTE's standard for PQ. All that is that's the recognized gamma associated with PQ. And PQ is the most popular and most widely accessible HDR gamma that there is. The other one is HLG, which really is mainly for live broadcast and backwards compatibility with older TVs. And you're mainly only seeing that being used by people like the BBC, like for example, the World Cup is being shown in HLG 4K over BBC iPlayer at the moment. But PQ is the more common gamma curve at the moment. There are essentially two main gamma curves. I don't think it's really a case of one being better than the other. They have two different functions. But if you're shooting and grading and delivering to YouTube or delivering HDR to Vimeo, you're going to want to use ST24 or PQ as it's known. PQ stands for Perceptual Quantizer. You just love all of these terms. Perceptual Quantizer. It's a gamma curve that is meant to very accurately recreate the luminance response of our eye, so it's very close to how we perceive luminance to mimic the way our eye responds to the world around us. So PQ is a very good one, and PQ is in fact the basis for HDR10, HDR10 Plus, Dolby Vision. In fact, it was Dolby that invented PQ, that worked on that as a standard with SMPTE. So it's the one that's kind of embedded in most of the work that you will do if you're working in HDR. So now I've set up the color gamut and gamma settings. There are a few other things I need to set. An important one here is the HDR mastering is 4. So with HLG this wouldn't matter because it's scene referred, it will adapt depending on the screen you're showing it on. But for PQ, Dolby Vision HDR10, these are limits that you're kind of going to say, you're telling it this is the display that I'm actually mastering for. This is a 1000 nit display, so I've set it for 1000 nits. It's pretty straightforward. The other thing that I'm going to do is just come into my preferences, user preferences, color, and enable my HDR scopes. You can actually grade this with normal SDR scopes, but it probably makes sense to use the HDR ones that show me clearly 100, which is the upper range for SDR, and then 1000, which is actually fits perfectly with what I'm using here. If I start grading immediately, I can do that. I can start working on this, but you'll notice I'm having to turn the wheels an awful lot because I'm coming from such a flat starting point with the raw there. To help with that, you can right-click on a node and change it into HDR mode. It allows you to quickly, there you go, with just a few spins, I'm actually pinning my highlights there. You don't have to have all of your nodes in HDR mode to grade HDR. It's just if you want normally that initial node to just allow you to make quicker changes quite easily for and optimized for HDR and PQ curves, then it's a good idea to start with that one. So if I pull this down and pull this up at the same time, I can actually quite quickly get this roughly where I want it. I'm going to add a new node now and just increase my contrast. Let's bring my highlights down just to make sure that my clipping point isn't clipping. And the brightest spot here, which you can see it's sitting just under 1000 nits, is the bright reflected light, the sun hitting the breast of this seagull, which is obviously a white bird. This is the type of thing that normally we'd have to clamp down to 100. And we've also got the specular highlights of the cars as they're driving past on the bridge above at the top there. Now those are clipped, but that's fine. You know, I don't think that matters at all. The thing is they're clipping at 1000, so they're physically very bright as they're being emitted from our screen, which places them in a much more realistic place.
The first thing I'm going to say on HDR is I love it. I'm a complete convert. I've got HDR TV. I've been trying to watch everything in HDR. I've become a little obsessed with HDR. In terms of production, if you're indoors, it's not going to make a major amount of difference if you're in a studio, unless obviously you can see outside. Then there's something maybe a little bit more to take into account with what you're going to hold. I think in terms of things, people have said it maybe makes a difference with skin tones and all that. I don't think it makes any difference with that. More the biggest thing on that with makeup and all that kind of stuff, that's 4K that's going to make that difference, not so much the HDR. When you get outside though with HDR, then you can start to look at an image a lot more and look at how much you're gathering. You might be starting to shoot scenes that you might not have shot before or shot a little bit more into the backlight. But the big thing I think that's quite interesting is everybody's going on about HDR. If you're exposing your stuff correctly over the last 3 or 4 years, we've all been shooting HDR anyway. So there's all this stuff that I keep reading about, I've got to expose stuff. I mean, I've been shooting with Canon C700 now for 3 years. And pretty much, that camera's had 15 stops, depending on what you've been shooting in and what log. So we've been shooting in HDR anyway. So it's just a case of exposing it. I've been reading some crazy stuff that people have been overexposing by 2 stops a lot lately. And I think that's just they haven't understood where to sit it on the waveform, and they're worried about noise and stuff in the black. So you're always going to get that. So, for me, all HDR is it just opens up a bigger image to start to work with.
If I pull this back here, what I want to be careful of is that I don't end up just pushing the whole image up like that, because that's not HDR. Your standard dynamic range of 0 to 100 nits is actually still applicable in HDR. That was chosen as your dynamic range for standard signals for a good reason. It's because most things fall within that range. The only things that don't are bright emittive light sources like the sun and light bulbs and things like that, and highly reflective specular reflections off of things like chrome, metal, very white reflective objects. Those sorts of things are what we couldn't handle in the past, but the majority of the world doesn't sit in those areas. So standard dynamic range isn't like dark, it's actually normal, and we've never been able to show highlights and specular highlights and things sitting on top of that. Now we can, so this is what we're opening up. So don't just bring your whole image up and sit it in this HDR range. You want to actually do the opposite. You want to try and sit the bulk of the image realistically. So I'm going to place my black right down to where they would normally sit. I'm going to bring my mids down. Again, just kind of thinking, I've got the bridge here. I can actually see on the scopes. Let's just make my scopes full screen. You can see actually this is the bridge here. So it's very bright. It's kind of sitting around about sort of 90 IRE, something like that. And that feels kind of like a good place for it to sit. So I'm going to place it probably around about there. So if that white, or it's a very light stone on the bridge there, if that's sitting up in the kind of the 90 to 100 nit kind of area, then we can safely say that anything that in reality was brighter and more reflective, and really I think the only other thing here is not even the sky. I think the sky is only a little bit brighter than that, but the light patch on the seagull's breast and the specular highlights from the car going beyond on the bridge behind them, those are the things that we kind of want. So I'm actually going to bring the mids down and try and get some separation between the mids and the highlights here. That's way too much. Let's just bring that up. Somewhere around about there. Now let's push in some saturation. Just get this looking a bit more saturated, normal looking. And I'm just going to go into my log. I'm just going to bring up some of those blacks because they look a little crushed down there. We've also got a little bit of a blue cast. Let's just warm this up. There we go. Now it's really coming alive. Let's just disable that. So that's that node there. We bypass everything. That's our original, as flat as a pancake, this. And this is now our full grade here. So that's our original. That's our grade. The really annoying thing is we're not delivering this course in HDR, so you're never going to be able to see by watching this what this looks like. But you have to trust me that in reality, this seagull is just popping out of the screen and much brighter than the things that are surrounding it. Its breast is falling at 1,000 nits, whereas the next brightest thing that's around it, which is the bridge behind, is just under 100 nits. So there's a tenfold increase in the difference between the brightnesses of those objects, and that's what you've never been able to do before with HDR. So in terms of the physical kind of grading process, there are a few things to remember. There's a little bit of setup, definitely, but then once you're into it with a proper calibrated HDR monitor, it feels just like any other kind of grading really, but with this kind of extra dimensionality to it that's just clients love particularly, and it's nice to work with as a colorist.
HDR in terms of, well, first of all, in viewing to clients, well, that's an interesting thing. I mean, we've been starting to play around. So far, the best way I've found, because obviously most of them, they're never going to have a computer monitor that can do it. They're not going to have a monitor that certainly can't do it. And I think the thing is the cameras and everything will record HDR. You can go off and buy a piece of gear to play it back. The monitors at the moment are still the very expensive piece if you want a proper grading monitor. But I mean, so the only way I've so far done it is either upload to Vimeo or YouTube and let people stream it back in 4K to an HDR enabled TV. But the results out of that are actually quite spectacular sometimes. Yeah, the thing is, it's been really interesting is the deliverable side of that is every month it seems to change. I know that we did some tests a while ago, this was only 3 months ago, and YouTube was doing the best HDR colors and you'd export something that looked fantastic. And now all of a sudden Vimeo seems to be doing something better than so. That's going to be the permanent flip-flop, I think, and it's going to take a while to level it out. Trying to get the metadata into the file seems to be a real pain at the moment. Sometimes it picks up the metadata, sometimes it's not picking up the metadata. It's flagging it as HDR, it's not flagging it as HDR. So that's the side that is becoming, a little bit frustrating. But each, as I say, it seems like every time a new piece of software comes out, it is getting improved.
The final step then is kind of delivering it. So if we jump to the deliver page with this, and I wanted to deliver this particular clip, there are presets for YouTube and Vimeo built into DaVinci Resolve. There are presets for YouTube and Vimeo built into Final Cut Pro 10 as well, and Premiere. With DaVinci Resolve, I can output this, and I don't have to do, there's no make HDR button. All you have to know is that as long as you've set that project up the way I've just shown you, and set the gamut and the gamma appropriately to use ST2084, the program knows that you're grading in HDR, and so when it delivers it, it will make sure that the correct elements that are required for that to be flagged up the other end on YouTube or on Vimeo are made correctly, and they are in there. All you need to do is make sure that you're outputting in a codec that supports that extended luminance range. Now that is the important bit. So don't do all of this work in an output as H.264, because that doesn't support HDR. You need H.265, which and there's a 10-bit version that you can use within DaVinci Resolve. So that will mean you're going to end up with some really good-looking stuff that supports the additional extended range of luminance and will play back correctly when playing HDR content on YouTube or Vimeo through your iPhone 10, which is HDR, iPad Pro is HDR. Increasingly, there are other mobile phones that are coming out that have HDR-capable screens. LG, Panasonic, Sony, Samsung, they're all bringing out HDR TVs now. And if you've got a web-connected one, a network-connected one with things like the YouTube and Vimeo apps, then as you play back this stuff, it'll automatically pick it up as HDR and show it correctly on that TV. And once you see it for the first time, you absolutely love it. It's an incredible experience. The first time you watch HDR, it's kind of mind-bogglingly good. And it's not like 3D, which always felt like a gimmick. It feels convincingly realistic. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to choose HEVC, which is H.265, 10-bit, and make sure it's outputting at the correct resolution for the project that I'm working on, which is 4K DCI. And just add it to the render queue and off it goes. Another good choice for codec with this would be, if you're using a Mac, the Apple ProRes codecs. They also support 10-bit, 422, and the HDR flags come through correctly with those files as well. So you're going to end up with bigger files than you might traditionally be used to, but when you upload those to YouTube or Vimeo or wherever you're putting them out, they will correctly be picked up and you'll be able to sit back and watch them in glorious HDR, and hopefully you can see it's not a huge amount of extra work, and the rewards at the end are just worth every single second you spend on it.
I haven't had a client actually specifically ask for HDR as yet. The clients I've shown the HDR stuff in have actually been blown away. 2 or 3 of them have actually asked about possibly finishing in HDR, and I would say to them, let's definitely do it. What we have been struggling is, because it's maybe a television broadcast, there's no point in doing it because we can't do it. What I've been trying to talk them into, and is let's do it as deliverable for TV via an app. What I want to see is the next generation computer screens start to come out in HDR, and then I think things will really start to change. So I know there are some laptops out there that now support HDR. I've been getting my clients to use iPad Pros, so that's now, I've got a little bit sick of clients viewing stuff on bad monitors or bad computer screens or bad TVs to try and tell you what they thought. So now what I do is I get everybody to look on, as I say, an iPad Pro. At least then we both have a bit of a standardization on what we're viewing, especially if they're on the other side of the world, and then I know when they say to me, oh, it's a little bit dark, I know as a reference point to what they're looking to. And that then works inside HDR. So then I know, what's looking, and the clients I've shown HDR playback on the iPads are blown away. So we just need the laptops now to start coming into HDR and a few other bits and pieces. I think once that happens, then it'll really start to snowball a lot more. Because when you look at SDR back then, you get very disappointed.
So I'm really happy with this shot. I'm really happy with the way this has worked, and it's now out there on YouTube, on Vimeo, ready for me and for other people to watch back in HDR. But a word of warning, HDR standards are evolving almost week by week. What I say to you now may well not be factually correct come a month from now. It is really rapidly evolving. There's people like SMPTE, there's people like VESA who are doing their bit to kind of set these standards, but it's a bit of a wild west out there at the moment. And you do have to be careful. So everything I've said, just, it's up to you to do what even people like Netflix, and they're pioneering this, and trust me, there are colorists that work for Netflix that are pulling their hair out every now and again and thinking about how they can kind of push this. It's as new for them as it is for any of us. And do what they do, you know, keep reading up about standards, keep testing. You know, there was a situation I had where at the end of last year, a load of HDR stuff I delivered, I had to deliver in DNX HR because that was the only way I could get it to work on YouTube. And now that doesn't work so well, and H.265 is doing what it should have done back then but wasn't. ProRes, I was also having issues with saturation, seemed to just go off the charts when I delivered in ProRes before, and now it seems fine. You've got Netflix and YouTube tweaking their algorithms behind the scenes. There's loads of different things at work here. And so this is, you know, I'm not saying don't go for it now. I'm saying just if you are going for it, test and test again and keep reading up, and just whatever you do, make sure you have fun with it.
Seeing the images that were shot on the ISO in HDR, it's really lovely. It spoils you though, because when you, well, I'm going to go back to my edit suite. I'm not going to have anything like that. I'm going to go back to SDR, and I will deal with it. And at some point, I'll have one of those myself.